My name is Sarah Mitchell, and the morning I discovered my father's true nature was the same morning he cast me out of the only home I'd ever known. I was 25 years old, 3 months pregnant, and about to learn that the man who preached about forgiveness from the pulpit had none to spare for his own daughter. The Riverside Community Church had been my entire world for as long as I could remember. My father, Pastor David Mitchell, was more than just a religious leader. He was the heartbeat of our small Texas town. Every Sunday, nearly 800 people filled those wooden pews to hear him speak about redemption, love, and the power of second chances. I grew up believing that our church was a sanctuary, a place where broken people came to heal. I was wrong about everything. The morning that changed my life forever started like any other. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, the same room I'd occupied for 25 years, with its faded pink wallpaper and shelves full of Christian literature. The nausea hit me immediately. Morning sickness had become my unwelcome alarm clock for the past few weeks. I pressed my hand to my still, flat stomach and whispered a prayer, asking God to help me find the courage to tell my father about the baby. Michael, the father of my child, had disappeared the moment I told him about the pregnancy. We'd been dating for 8 months, and I genuinely believed he loved me. He'd even talked about marriage, about how we'd raise our children in the church, about how proud Pastor Mitchell would be to have him as a son-in-law. But when I whispered those two life-changing words, "I'm pregnant," his face went blank, and within a week, he'd moved to another state without even saying goodbye. I'd been carrying this secret for 3 months, my loose clothing hiding the truth from everyone at church. But I knew I couldn't hide it much longer. My father would have to know eventually. And I desperately hoped that the man who preached about unconditional love would show some of that same grace to his own daughter. I found him in his study at 7 in the morning, as was his routine. The room smelled of old books and coffee, with morning light streaming through the tall windows behind his massive oak desk. He was reviewing his sermon notes for the upcoming Sunday service, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. At 52, my father still cut an impressive figure, tall, distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair, and a voice that could command a room. "Good morning, Daddy," I said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up from his papers, and for a moment, his face softened the way it used to when I was a little girl bringing him drawings I'd made in Sunday school. "Morning, sweetheart. You're up early today." I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say this, no perfect moment that would make the words less shocking. "Daddy, I need to tell you something important." His expression became more alert, and he set down his pen. "What is it?" "Sarah, I'm pregnant." The silence that followed those two words was deafening. I watched as my father's face transformed from concern to confusion to something I'd never seen directed at me before. Disgust. He stood up slowly from his chair, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What did you just say?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach drop. "I'm 3 months pregnant, Daddy. I know this isn't what we planned, but, planned." He interrupted, his voice rising. "Sarah, do you understand what you've done? Do you comprehend the shame you've brought on this family, on this church?" I felt tears starting to blur my vision. This wasn't how I'd imagined this conversation going. "Daddy, I made a mistake, but people make mistakes. You preach about forgiveness every Sunday. You always said that God's love. Don't you dare quote scripture to me." He slammed his hand down on the desk, causing me to jump. "You are an unmarried woman who has engaged in fornication, and now you're carrying the evidence of your sin. Do you think I can stand in front of my congregation, knowing that my own daughter is a living testament to moral failure?" The cruelty in his words hit me like physical blows. This was my father, the man who had taught me to pray, who had held me when I cried over skinned knees and broken hearts. But the person standing before me now was a stranger, someone more concerned with his reputation than with his daughter's well-being. "Where is the father?" he demanded. "He left," I whispered, my voice barely audible through my tears. "He left when I told him." My father's laugh was cold and bitter. "Of course he did. What man wants to be tied to a woman with so little self-respect? Sarah, you've made your bed. And now you have to lie in it. But you won't be doing it under my roof." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. What do you mean? I mean you need to pack your things and leave. Today, I won't have a fornicator living in my house, bringing shame on everything I've worked to build. Daddy, please? I begged, reaching out toward him. I'm your daughter. I need help, I need my family. He stepped back as if my touch would contaminate him. You stopped being my daughter the moment you spread your legs for some boy who couldn't even be bothered to marry you first. The Sarah I raised would never have brought this kind of disgrace on our family. His words were like acid, burning through every happy memory I had of our relationship. Where am I supposed to go? I don't have any money. I don't have anywhere else to live. You should have thought of that before you opened your legs, he said coldly. There are shelters for girls like you. Places where unwed mothers go to deal with their poor choices. Girls like me, I repeated, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. Sluts. He said the word hanging in the air like a weapon. Women who can't control their base desires and end up pregnant and abandoned. You're not special, Sarah. You're just another cautionary tale. I don't remember leaving his study. I don't remember walking upstairs to my room, or packing my few belongings into 2 suitcases. I felt like I was moving through a nightmare, waiting to wake up and find that none of this was real. But when I came back downstairs with my bags, my father was waiting by the front door. Here, he said, holding out $200 in cash. This should be enough to get you started somewhere else. I stared at the money, then at his face. Daddy, please don't do this. I know you're angry, but I'm still your daughter. This baby is your grandchild. No, he said firmly. This baby is a bastard child born from sin, and you are no daughter of mine. The congregation will be told that you've moved away to pursue other opportunities. Your name will not be mentioned in this house again. He opened the front door and stepped aside, clearly expecting me to walk through it. I looked around the foyer one last time. At the family photos on the walls, at the cross hanging by the door that my father kissed every time he left the house. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. I love you, Daddy, I whispered as I picked up my suitcases. He didn't respond. He just watched as I walked out the door, and I heard it close behind me with a finality that echoed in my chest. That was how I found myself, at 25 years old and 3 months pregnant, standing on a sidewalk in front of the house where I'd grown up, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The $200 my father had given me might last a week if I was careful. I had no car, no job, and no family who would acknowledge my existence. I walked to the bus station and bought a ticket to Austin, figuring a bigger city might offer more opportunities for someone in my situation. The 3-hour bus ride gave me time to think, to try to process what had just happened to my life. I kept waiting to feel angry, to feel rage at my father's cruelty. But all I felt was numb. Austin was overwhelming after a lifetime in a small town. I used some of my precious cash to stay in a cheap motel while I looked for work, but finding employment while obviously pregnant proved nearly impossible. After a week of rejections, I was down to my last $30 when I walked into a diner called Mel's Place and begged the owner, a weathered woman named Dorothy, for any kind of work. Honey, I can see you're in a tough spot, Dorothy said, looking me up and down with kind but shrewd eyes. I can't pay much, but I can give you some shifts waiting tables. Tips aren't great, but it's something. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. Dorothy also let me sleep in the storage room above the diner for $50 a week, which was all I could afford. The room was barely bigger than a closet, with a single mattress on the floor and a hot plate, but it was shelter. For the next 3 months, I worked double shifts at the diner, saving every penny I could for when the baby came. My feet swelled, my back ached, and some nights I was so exhausted I could barely climb the stairs to my tiny room. But I was surviving, and slowly, I was beginning to believe that maybe I could build a life for myself and my child without my father's church, without his approval. That's when I met Elena Rodriguez. Elena was a regular customer at the diner, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who always ordered black coffee and wheat toast. She was a social worker for the state of Texas, and after watching me struggle through morning sickness during my shifts for several weeks, she struck up a conversation. Honey, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world, she said one quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the diner was nearly empty. Something about her maternal warmth broke through the walls I'd built around myself, And I found myself telling her everything. About my father, about being thrown out, about trying to make it on my own. Elena listened without judgment, nodding occasionally and asking gentle questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Your father is Pastor David Mitchell from Riverside Community Church, she asked. You know him? Elena's expression darkened. I know of him. Sarah, I need to tell you something. For the past 2 years, my department has been investigating your father's church. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean, investigating? Financial irregularities. Your father has been filing as a nonprofit organization, which means he doesn't pay taxes on the church's income, but we have reason to believe he's been diverting church funds for personal use. Cars, vacations, home improvements, all paid for with money that was donated specifically for church operations and charitable work. I stared at her in shock. That can't be right. My father lives modestly. He always preached about the dangers of materialism. Elena pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. It was my father's house. But it looked different than I remembered. There was a new swimming pool in the backyard, a 3-car garage that hadn't been there when I lived at home, and what looked like a completely renovated exterior. This photo was taken last month, Elena said. The pool alone cost $40,000. The renovations totaled over $150,000. All paid for with checks written from the church's building fund. I felt sick. The building fund was sacred in our congregation. People scraped together their last dollars to contribute to it, believing they were helping to expand God's work in the community. Elderly parishioners on fixed incomes donated their Social Security checks. Young families skipped meals to make their monthly pledges. But why are you telling me this? I asked. Elena leaned forward. Because we've been trying to build a case, but we need someone with inside knowledge. Someone who has access to church records. Who knows how the financial systems work. Your father has been very careful to cover his tracks, but there might be documents, records. Something that could prove what he's been doing. I shook my head. I don't have access to anything anymore. He threw me out, remember? Sarah. You lived in that house for 25 years. You helped with church administrative work throughout high school and college. You know more about how that church operates than almost anyone. And more importantly, you know your father. You know his habits, his patterns, his weaknesses. She reached across the table and took my hand. I can't promise anything, but if we could build a solid case against him, there would be justice. And there might be financial compensation for you as a whistleblower. I thought about my father's cold words, about being called a slut and thrown out on the street. I thought about sleeping in a storage room above a diner, while he enjoyed his new swimming pool paid for with widow's mites. What would I need to do? Elena smiled. Just think, Sarah. Think about everything you remember. Every conversation you overheard, every document you might have seen. Every detail about how money flowed through that church. We'll start there and see what we can piece together. Over the next several weeks, Elena and I met regularly. At first, I felt guilty, like I was betraying my father, and everything I'd been raised to believe about loyalty and family. But as Elena showed me more evidence of his theft, as I saw how much money had been stolen from people who could barely afford to give it, my guilt transformed into something else, righteous anger. I remembered things I hadn't thought about in years. How my father always paid for everything in cash, claiming it helped him stay humble and avoid the temptations of credit. How he'd installed a safe in his study, telling me it was for important church documents, but never letting anyone else see inside it. How he'd been taking increasingly expensive, spiritual retreats to luxury resorts, always alone, always claiming they were necessary for his ministry. But the most damning memory came to me one night as I was lying on my mattress, feeling the baby kick inside me. I remembered being 16 years old and helping my father organize his study. He'd been drinking, something he did more often at home than anyone at church knew, and he'd been unusually talkative. Sarah, he'd said, pointing to a filing cabinet in the corner. That cabinet contains everything that keeps this church running. Financial records, donor information, building permits. Someday, when I'm gone, someone will need to know where everything is. At the time, I'd thought he was just being practical, preparing for the future. But now I realized he'd been drunk enough to reveal more than he intended. He'd shown me exactly where he kept the records that could destroy him. The problem was getting access to those records. My father had changed the locks on the house immediately after throwing me out, and he'd made it clear I wasn't welcome on the property. But I knew something he didn't think I knew: the combination to his study safe. When I was 12 years old, I'd walked into his study unexpectedly and caught him opening the safe. He'd been startled and had fumbled the combination, having to start over. I watched as he entered the numbers 10-1-78. It was my mother's birthday, October 14, 1978. She'd died when I was 10, and my father, despite his harsh exterior, had never stopped loving her memory. I told Elena about the safe, and her eyes lit up with the first real hope I'd seen since we started working together. "Sarah, if we can get into that safe, we might find everything we need. Bank statements, receipts, maybe even records of other financial improprieties we don't know about yet. But how am I supposed to get into the house? He'll call the police if he sees me." Elena thought for a moment. "When does your father leave the house on a regular schedule?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday morning. He goes to the regional pastors' meeting in Houston. He leaves at 6 a.m. and doesn't get back until evening." "And you still have a key to the house?" I shook my head. "He changed the locks." "What about other ways in?" "Windows, a back door." I thought about the house where I'd grown up, mentally walking through every room. "There's a basement window that never locked properly. My father always meant to fix it but never got around to it. It's on the side of the house where the neighbors can't see." Elena nodded slowly. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. What I'm suggesting isn't exactly legal. If you get caught, there could be consequences. You'd be breaking and entering, even if it is your childhood home." I looked down at my swollen belly. At the life growing inside me that would soon need food, clothing, medical care, and a future. I thought about all the people my father had stolen from. All the families who had sacrificed their own needs to support what they thought was God's work. "He threw me out with nothing," I said quietly. "He called his own daughter a slut, and left me homeless while he lived in luxury paid for with stolen money. I think it's time someone held him accountable." 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late February, I found myself standing outside my childhood home at 6:30 a.m., watching my father's car disappear down the street toward the highway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my hands were steady. I walked around to the side of the house, where the old basement window waited. Just as I remembered it. The window was painted shut, but years of Texas weather had cracked the paint, and I was able to work it open with a screwdriver I'd borrowed from the diner. Climbing through that window while 7 months pregnant was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done physically, but somehow I managed it. I found myself in the basement that had once been my playroom, surrounded by boxes of old Christmas decorations and furniture covered in dust sheets. The house felt different, not just because I was trespassing, but because it no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum of a life I'd once lived, preserved but no longer real. I made my way upstairs to my father's study, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. The massive oak desk, the wall of theological books, the comfortable reading chair by the window. But now I saw it differently. Now I saw the expensive rug that had appeared sometime after I'd moved out. The new computer that probably cost more than most of his parishioners made in a month. The safe was hidden behind a framed print of the Last Supper. My hands trembled as I moved the picture aside and revealed the digital keypad. I took a deep breath and entered the combination, 10-1-78. The safe opened with a soft electronic beep. Inside was exactly what Elena had hoped to find, and more than I could have imagined. Stacks of cash, easily $10,000 or more. Bank statements showing regular transfers from church accounts to personal accounts. Receipts for personal purchases paid with church credit cards. But what made me gasp out loud was a manila folder labeled, "Emergency Fund," that contained something I never expected to see. It was a life insurance policy on my mother, who had died 15 years earlier. The beneficiary was listed as the church, but there was a handwritten note in my father's writing, "Personal use authorized by pastoral discretion." The policy had paid out $2 to $50,000 when my mother died. Money that the congregation believed had been donated to establish a scholarship fund in her memory. There had never been any scholarship fund. My father had taken the money meant to honor my mother's memory, and used it for his own purposes. I photographed everything with my phone. Every bank statement, every receipt, every document that showed the systematic theft of church funds. Some of the receipts were for things so petty they were almost comical: expensive dinners, premium gasoline, even liquor purchases despite my father's public stance on abstinence from alcohol. But the most damning evidence was a leather-bound ledger that detailed every theft going back 5 years. My father, in his obsessive need for control, had kept meticulous records of his own crimes. Every misappropriated dollar was documented, along with notes about how he'd covered his tracks. As I photographed the ledger, I came across an entry that made my blood run cold. Discretionary fund for Sarah's future, the $15,000. Below it was a note. Transferred to personal account pending resolution of family situation. He had stolen money that was specifically designated for my future and used it for himself. Even after throwing me out, even after disowning me, he had continued to profit from the congregation's generosity toward his daughter. I finished photographing everything, and carefully returned the documents to their original positions. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something else. A new envelope that hadn't been there when I'd started. It was marked, confidential, board eyes only, and was sealed but not locked away like everything else. I opened it, and found a proposal my father had written to the church board, requesting approval for a sabbatical year that would include travel to the Holy Land, for spiritual renewal and enhanced ministry preparation. The budget he'd outlined was $75,000, all to be paid from the church's mission fund. The mission fund that was supposed to support overseas orphanages and disaster relief. I photographed that document too, then sealed the envelope and left it where I'd found it. I replaced the picture over the safe and made my way back down to the basement and out through the window. By 8:00 a.m., I was back at the diner, and by 9:00 a.m., I was sitting across from Elena, showing her the evidence that would destroy my father's life. Elena's eyes grew wider with each photograph. "Sarah, this is more than we ever hoped to find. This isn't just financial impropriety, this is systematic fraud on a massive scale. Your father could face serious federal charges for this. What happens now? Now we turn this over to the authorities. The state will investigate. And if the evidence holds up, which it will, your father will be arrested and charged. The church will likely lose its tax-exempt status temporarily while everything gets sorted out. And Sarah," she looked at me seriously, "there will be a media firestorm. This won't be quiet." I thought about my father's reputation, about the congregation that trusted him, about the life he'd built on lies and theft. "Good," I said finally. "Let everyone see who he really is." The investigation moved quickly once Elena submitted the evidence. Within a week, state auditors were crawling through every financial record the church possessed. Within 2 weeks, the local newspaper ran a front-page story. "Local pastor under investigation for embezzlement." I watched from Austin as my father's world began to crumble. The initial story led to more investigation, which revealed even more theft than we'd originally uncovered. It turned out my father had been running his scheme for nearly 8 years, stealing over $400,000 from the church and its members. The congregation was devastated. These were people who had trusted him completely, who had given sacrificially because they believed in the ministry he claimed to represent. Elderly members who had donated their life savings. Young families who had given up vacations and luxuries to support the church. All of them had been betrayed by the man they'd looked up to as their spiritual leader. But what broke my heart more than anything was reading the interviews with parishioners who blamed themselves. They wondered if they had somehow failed as Christians, if their faith had been misplaced. They questioned their own judgment, and their ability to trust anyone again. 3 weeks after the investigation began, my father was arrested at his home on multiple counts of embezzlement, tax fraud, and wire fraud. The mugshot that appeared in the newspaper showed a man I barely recognized. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, looking far older than his 52 years. The arraignment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week that my father used to attend his regional pastors' meetings. I took a bus from Austin to be there, not because I wanted to gloat or seek revenge, but because I needed to see this through to the end. The courtroom was packed with members of our former congregation, reporters, and curious townspeople. I sat in the back, my 8-month, pregnant belly making it difficult to find a comfortable position, and watched as my father was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He looked around the courtroom as he was seated, and his eyes found mine. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I saw something I'd never seen in my father's face before. Fear. Not anger. Not disappointment. Not the cold dismissal he'd shown me when he threw me out. Fear. The prosecutor read the charges: 11 counts of embezzlement, 7 counts of tax fraud, 3 counts of wire fraud. The total amount stolen was $427,000. If convicted on all counts, my father faced up to 25 years in federal prison. His attorney, a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the case, entered a plea of not guilty. But I could see in my father's face that he knew it was hopeless. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented. He had, in his meticulous way, created his own indictment. After the arraignment, as people filed out of the courtroom, several members of the congregation approached me. I had been prepared for anger, for blame, for accusations that I had betrayed my own father. Instead, I found something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had been my Sunday school teacher, took my hands in her wrinkled ones. "Sarah, dear, I'm so sorry for what he did to you. And I'm so grateful that you had the courage to expose the truth. We needed to know." A Mr. and Mrs. Garcia, a young couple with 3 small children, hugged me carefully around my pregnant belly. "You saved us from giving him even more money we couldn't afford to give," Mrs. Garcia said through tears. "We were planning to take out a loan to increase our tithing. Thank God you stopped this before it got worse." One by one, people who had been my father's parishioners thanked me for exposing his crimes. They told me about the sacrifices they'd made, about the money they'd given thinking it was going to help others, about their relief that the truth had finally come out. But the most meaningful conversation was with Dorothy Wilkins, the church organist who had played for every service for the past 20 years. "Sarah," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "your father destroyed a lot of people's faith in church leadership. But watching you stand up for what's right, even when it cost you everything, that restored my faith in God's people. You did the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing." As I rode the bus back to Austin that night, I reflected on how different my life looked now compared to 9 months earlier. I was still pregnant, and essentially homeless, still working at a diner for minimal pay. But I was no longer carrying the weight of my father's lies, no longer complicit in his theft through my silence. 3 months later, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl I named Grace. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. My father, who had preached about grace for 20 years, had shown none to his own daughter. But I was determined to raise my daughter with the kind of unconditional love I had always longed for. Alana helped me apply for the state's whistleblower compensation program, and 6 months after Grace was born, I received a check for $85,000, 20% of the money recovered from my father's accounts. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to put a down payment on a small house and start building a stable life for my daughter. My father was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the church and its members. The Riverside Community Church eventually recovered, bringing in a new pastor and implementing strict financial oversight to prevent future abuse. I never visited my father in prison, and he never wrote to me. The last conversation we had was that morning in his study, when he called me a slut and threw me out of his house. In a way, I was grateful for that finality. There were no complicated emotions to sort through, no false reconciliations or empty apologies. He had shown me exactly who he was, and I had responded accordingly. 5 years later, I'm sitting in my own small house, watching Grace play in the backyard while I write this story. She's a curious, joyful child who asks endless questions and gives unlimited hugs. She knows her grandfather is in prison, but she doesn't know the details yet. Someday I'll tell her the full story, but for now, she's content knowing that sometimes adults make bad choices and have to face consequences. I never returned to organized religion after everything that happened. My faith was too damaged, my trust too broken. But I found my own relationship with God, one based on justice and truth rather than blind obedience to flawed leaders. Grace will grow up understanding that morality comes from within, not from the pulpit. The most important lesson I learned through all of this wasn't about my father's hypocrisy or the church's corruption. It was about my own strength. For 25 years, I had defined myself through my father's approval, through my role as the pastor's daughter, through other people's expectations of who I should be. But when I was stripped of all of that, when I lost my family, my home, my community, I discovered that I was still complete. I was still valuable. I was still worthy of love and respect, even if the people who should have given it to me refused to do so. My father spent his life preaching about redemption, but he never understood what it really meant. True redemption isn't about avoiding consequences or maintaining appearances. It's about taking responsibility for your actions, making amends when possible, and choosing to do better. I redeemed myself not by returning to my father's church or seeking his forgiveness, but by choosing truth over family loyalty, justice over personal comfort. I redeemed the money he stole by ensuring it was returned to the people he'd robbed, and I redeemed my own future by refusing to let his rejection define my worth. Today, Grace is playing with building blocks, constructing elaborate towers, and knocking them down with giggles of delight. She doesn't know that her existence was once called a shame, that her birth was seen as evidence of her mother's moral failure. To her, she is simply a beloved daughter in a home filled with love. That's the real victory in this story. Not my father's downfall, or the money I recovered, or the justice that was served. The real victory is the little girl in my backyard, who will never doubt that she is wanted, valued, and loved unconditionally. My father tried to cast me out of his kingdom, but I built my own instead, and unlike his, mine is built on truth. Did you like this story? Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of betrayal and redemption, please support us with a super thanks, so we can continue bringing you more incredible life stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support. We look forward to your comments about Sarah's amazing journey. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that we highly recommend. There's so much more content on our channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.